Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ana Cabrera along with Jose Diaz-Balart here in New York for special coverage of a pretrial hearing in Georgia that could jeopardize the entire Fulton County RICO case against former President Donald Trump.
We expect the court to resume any minute now as soon as a key witness arrives at the courthouse. Willis, however, will not be taking the stand today after delivering a fiery defense Thursday, calling allegations she benefited financially from a romantic relationship with her deputy on the case lies, and forcefully reminding the court that she is not the one on trial.
We're also awaiting a verdict in the $370 million New York civil fraud trial against former President Trump and his namesake business. Now, this verdict could come at any time.
Also today, international condemnation growing after Vladimir Putin's biggest political rival reportedly dies in prison. The circumstances surrounding his death leaving many asking, was the Kremlin directly involved?
Let's begin with the second day of that hearing into Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis and the allegations of misconduct. I'm going to go right to the Atlanta courthouse where MSNBC's Katie Fang is joining us. Katie, court, as we mentioned, is in recess right now, but we are expecting this second day of testimony in this blockbuster hearing to get underway very soon. What should we expect?
So, Ana and Jose, as always, things are so fluid. We knew that Fani Willis had basically left the stand yesterday, but was still subject to cross-examination by her own state of Georgia lawyers. But this morning, it was announced that there were no questions for Fani Willis. So she has been excused from testimony. She's done. We are waiting for the arrival of Mr. Terrence Bradley. If his name sounds familiar to you all, it's because he is the former divorce lawyer for Nathan Wade. He showed up yesterday, was supposed to be the first witness for the defense. After some fits and starts, he eventually took the stand. But then there was immediate legal wrangling over the attorney-client privilege and whether or not it prevented him from being able to provide testimony about significantly the timing of the personal relationship between Nathan Wade and Fani Willis. Mr. Bradley on his way to court, according to his lawyers. Once he arrives, court will resume, and we should hear some testimony from him.
And so, Katie, Willis testified for hours yesterday. We're also hearing from several other witnesses. What is the judge considering this morning?
So the judge, based upon, I think, when you have somebody like Mr. Bradley back on the stand, the judge is now not going to focus on the finances so much as the timeline of that personal relationship. And everybody asks, Jose, why should we care about the timing of that? Well, because part of the motion to disqualify DA Fani Willis hedges on the idea that because of that personal relationship that she had with Nathan Wade as a special prosecutor that she appointed, that's why she appointed him, that she put him into that position so that he would actually reap some financial windfall that she would be able to participate in. Recall yesterday, a former DA, Fulton County employee and former friend of Fani Willis said that, in fact, their relationship began in October of 2019, not in March of 2022, which is what Wade and Willis are saying. Terrence Bradley's testimony could be very interesting if he supports the defense's theory that, in fact, that personal relationship began between Willis and Wade before he was appointed special prosecutor.
Katie Fang, thank you very much. Stay close, obviously. And joining us now, Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel, former senior member of the Mueller probe, Charles Coleman, civil rights attorney and also an MSNBC legal analyst, and Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official.
So let's start with you here, Andrew. It was a dramatic day in court yesterday, and we last heard Fani Willis herself on the stand. She was pretty confrontational. She had lengthy answers to, she said, be comprehensive and show she had nothing to hide. Were you surprised the state didn't bring her back to the stand today?
No, I thought it was a really smart move. I agree with you, Badu. Yesterday was a roller coaster. It was sort of like up, down, up, down. Obviously, that's the way trials work, and we're not at the end of it. We could have a lot more, as Katie just said. But I think it was a really smart move for the state not to ask any questions. Why? One, she got her story out. And it's not like, as you said, I mean, she spoke at length for hours. So there's not a lot to gain by asking her more questions. And what did they do by not asking any questions? One, they signaled to the judge, she wasn't damaged at all. She wasn't hurt. There was nothing that they didn't sort of lay a glove on her. So you don't need to ask any questions. Second, by not asking questions, you do not give the defense another opportunity to ask questions, because if you don't ask questions, there's nothing to rebut. So I think it was a very smart move.
So, Charles, we were here yesterday at this very same time when it was about half hour into what we learned to be an up and down roller coaster day. What do you expect today, and what do you think the impact of Willis's testimony was yesterday?
I think Fani Willis took a case that was in doubt, and she placed it firmly in the hands of her office. I think that after Mr. Wade testified, there were some questions as to the credibility of his story, what it was he was saying. And then, of course, there was Ms. Yurdi who was on the stand, and she testified basically in a way that was going to be harmful. At the point that Ms. Willis took the stand, there were legitimate questions, I think, as to whether she was fit or whether they were going to find her fit, rather, to move forward with this prosecution. But I think that her testimony added context to what Mr. Wade testified to and did enough to refute what Ms. Yurdi said in a way that ultimately dispelled any of those questions. In terms of today, what I'm looking for is, can the defense put on a witness or witnesses that are going to create a legitimate controversy such that they can advance this argument around disqualification? They have not done it at this point. At any sort of opening that they had, Ms. Willis closed with her testimony on the stand. I think Fani Willis did an exceptional job of doing that as a witness. She came across as being relatively personable, and that is because of her passion. It's an understandable passion that she had. She did come in hot, and a lot of people got upset when I said that, or when I remember our colleague Katie Tur said it, and people got upset about that. She did come in hot, but after that first break that the judge gave her, she settled in, she hit a rhythm, and she was very, very clear in her testimony about what it was that she wanted to get out, despite the fact that she basically walked merchants around the courtroom in terms of her inability to control her as a witness. That's just a matter of lawyering and skill. Ultimately, she did what she needed to do, and so now the defense has to put a witness on that's going to create a controversy.
And she had incoming from multiple defense attorneys. Correct. Because, again, these charges, or this allegation, I should say, was brought by Michael Roman, one of the co-defendants, but Trump's attorney was there questioning her. Another co-defendant's attorney was there questioning her because some of these other co-defendants had sort of jumped on to this motion that she should be disqualified. So, Chuck, I'm curious to get your take. After all we witnessed yesterday, did Fani Willis help or hurt herself? And what are you watching for today?
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I think she helped herself, and by helping herself, more importantly, Anna, she's helping the district attorney's office and the people of Fulton County. I mean, that should be her goal, not self-preservation, but doing justice for the people she's sworn to serve.
And the case, of course, that they had before then into the election interference.
Yeah, cases matter a lot more than she does, and that's true of every prosecutor in every jurisdiction, state and federal. But this is precisely why, Anna, jurors are always told to consider all of the evidence, right? If we had all voted after the first witness, we might have voted one way. If we had all voted after the second witness, we might have voted another way. Jurors are routinely told by the judge at the beginning of a trial to consider all of the evidence and all of the arguments that they hear. And, of course, they're not permitted to vote until all the evidence is done and all the arguments are done, and they've been instructed on the law. Here, of course, no jury, so the judge plays the role of trier of fact. But I think it's a good reminder for all of us to consider all of the evidence. More to come.
And Andrew, you know, looking at this, there seemed to be many different layers and levels to what was being discussed. First, when did you all start dating? Then, when was it a romantic relationship? And then, where did you go with him? And then, who paid for what? And was it a business credit card or cash? And where were the cash apps? All of these different layers and levels. What, remind us once again, basically the ethos of this case going on is what?
Exactly. So people who are thinking this case is being focused right now on when is there a relationship and is it improper to have a relationship? No, that is not what this case is about. It is also not that Fani Willis is on trial. That is also not the case. This is what the judge is looking for is follow the money. He is concerned about, is there a contract that the DA's office has with Mr. Wade that the DA herself is profiting from? It's all, that is what he said I am interested in. There is so far uncontradicted evidence from Mr. Wade and Ms. Willis that they split everything. There's a whole issue about, is it credible? Because there's an issue of he paid at times, she paid at times, and she says, I repaid in cash and I didn't use Venmo or Zelle or any sort of app. But there is no contrary evidence. So to my mind, what I'm looking for is, will there be contrary evidence to that issue, the finance issue presented by the defense? Because that's why we're here.
Right. So, Charles, we're going to hear presumably from this Terrence Bradley, who's a divorce lawyer, former divorce lawyer for Nathan Wade, also former business partner for Nathan Wade, and presumably they've worked out the attorney-client privilege issues that were all tangling things up yesterday at the start of the hearing. If you are Michael Roman's attorney who brought this allegation forward and are trying to get the case dismissed on all of this, what needs to happen today?
Michael Roman did everything he could, being the cyber sleuth that he is, to try and basically extract information from Mr. Wade's divorce proceedings to try and lead them to a victory, to give them the dots to make a connection. And the attorneys haven't done it. And they need to. And so to Andrew's point, and what most lawyers who are watching this, who are now familiar with disqualification law in the state of Georgia, are saying, you have to actually make a connection that is going to create an actual conflict. These pieces, these suggestions, these inferences that have led us to this point are not sufficient to get us to a point of disqualification. So if you want the disqualification that you've moved for, you've gotten a hearing that you asked for, you put all this stuff in the pleadings, now you have to actually connect the dots through witness testimony and other evidence. I'm sure, based off of the line of questioning that they had around Ms. Willis and the cash, that they were not expecting her to have an answer for where are the bank transactions that would substantiate this. She substantiated that through her evidence, through the testimony she provided. She gave context. That's out the window. So how are you now going to connect the dots in such a way that substantiates your story that somehow she was receiving an improper benefit and therefore should be disqualified? If I'm Mr. Roman and I'm looking at my attorneys, I'm thinking to myself, I've given you as many breadcrumbs as I can to lead you to the promised land. I need you to get us there.
All right, Charles Coleman, Andrew Weissman, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you all. Stay close. We'll have much more of the special coverage coming right up.
But up next, breaking news this morning out of Russia as the country's... We are keeping our eyes on that blockbuster Georgia hearing, but we're also expecting a decision at any moment now in former President Donald Trump's New York City fraud trial.
He could be forced to pay up to $370 million, and he could end up banned for life from New York's real estate businesses. Now, the judge has already ruled Trump engaged in fraud, so let's get to our Yasmin Vasugian outside Trump Tower for, what we can expect here. What do we know, Yasmin, about when and how it might come down, this verdict today?
Good morning, you guys. Good to talk to both of you. So we know it's today. We don't know the timing of it. Initially, it was expected that Engoron was going to deliver a decision in late January. Then it got pushed to early February. And now we're looking at today for this major decision to come down. And Anna, you said it, and it's important to note again. Engoron has already ruled here that the former president, along with the Trump org, have engaged in fraud, right? That is not the question today. The question today is how much, to what degree did they engage in that fraudulent activity. AG Letitia James asking for $370 million, along with the former president and Trump organization essentially being banned from engaging in any real estate activity in this city. You think about that. You think about his brand, who he has been through the 80s and 90s. This is going to be, this decision today, guys, however it comes down, and especially considering that Engoron has already ruled that he's engaged in fraud, is going to be a real gut punch to the former president along with his family as well. And let's not forget, this started on October 2nd, the former president along with his 3 children testifying in this trial.
Yeah, and Yasmin, and we're talking about that $370 million. Prosecutors were originally asking for $250 at the start of the trial. So break down how that number for us changed and varied.
So it's not very complicated. Essentially, it's for instance, interest accrued from money that was fraudulently obtained. It is bonuses that were given, for instance, to Alan Weisselberg, who helped fraudulently come up with some of these documents. It was valuations of property that were sold off. And that's how Letitia James is coming up with this now new number of $370 million. I quickly, though, want to walk you through some of the assets that Donald Trump is looking at in this city right now, because it's got to be made clear here, right? The only building that Donald Trump owns, the Trump Organization owns and operates in this city fully, is the building behind me. It's Trump Tower. All the other buildings with his name on it, many of them, his name has only been licensed. For instance, he owns a building around the corner with only a 30% stake in that. So Forbes essentially estimating his overall real estate value throughout the city is just over $400 million or so. The value of Trump Tower behind me, various estimations have been made around $200 million, $250 million, $150 million, although he's got $100 million in debt in this building. So his net profit, if he were to sell it, for instance, he'd walk away with really only $60 million or so. So if you think about that, right, $370 million possibly, $83 million, by the way, to E. Jean Carroll, along with another $5 million from that previous judgment on the E. Jean Carroll defamation case. That's going to be a lot of money the former president is going to have to pay out here. And some of it may have to come from the assets that he owns in this city.
Yasmin Vasugian, thank you so much. Stay close, obviously. This could come down any minute now.
Let's bring back Andrew Weissman, Charles Coleman, and Chuck Rosenberg now. Andrew, as we're waiting for this verdict, as we discussed, the judge in this case already found there was fraud committed by Trump, by his children who run this business, and by a couple of his execs. So what goes into the decision on the penalty?
Sure. So there are some additional liability causes of action that we will get a decision on. It's sort of somewhat irrelevant. It's icing because there's already one finding with respect to the first cause of action. But just to anticipate what we should expect is there will be 6 other causes of action where the judge has to decide, is there liability there? There are different elements to that, so that's why there's still a decision on that. But the big issue is the penalty. What will the amount be? And then also, is Donald Trump going to be barred for life, which is what the state wants to do, is bar him from life, saying this is a recidivist. He is a recidivist fraudster. We have to protect New York citizens. He needs to be barred. And then finally, whatever the amount is, if there isn't sort of ready cash, because there's a monitor, there can be forced sales where the court with a monitor will oversee forcing the sale of a sufficient number of assets until the money is paid.
And so, Charles, if the judge decides, I don't know, 370, could he decide for more? And let's say that he says, yes, 370 million, done deal. Is that a final deal for Trump, or is there some avenue for him to go forward?
Well, to your first question, the judge could ultimately impose additional penalties other than what the state attorney general has asked. I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen here. The biggest question, as Andrew has already talked about, is whether he's going to get the corporate death penalty. I do not believe that he will. It's only been given out a handful of times in the history of New York State and under a very specific set of circumstances that we don't have here. However, I do agree that if he does, the biggest argument in favor of that will be his penchant for recidivism. That is going to be the thing. Now, in terms of whether this is going to be the final issue for Donald Trump, my answer to you is absolutely not. He is going to appeal this order regardless of whatever the amount is. He is absolutely going to appeal the amount of the... He could file it in New York State Court of Appeals. He could try there, and that's ultimately where it's going to be heard. And he is going to do that not only with this judgment, but also with the state judgment with regard to E. Jean Carroll. That's also going to be something that he appeals in terms of the amount that has been levied on him, because, as Yasmin already talked about, this is a guy who doesn't have the money. So expect the New York State Court of Appeals to hear both of these things in terms of the amounts of these judgments that are coming his way, regardless of whatever it is that Engoron ultimately decides.
Chuck, coming back to whether the former president could be barred for life from leading business in this state, do you think that's likely?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I mean, I trust Charles's instincts on that. He's quite right that corporate death penalty, barring somebody for life from doing business, is rather unusual. But, you know, we're not going to know the answer to this for quite some time. Again, to Charles's point, Mr. Trump is going to appeal any verdict here, and it will be an adverse verdict. There's no doubt about that. He's certainly going to appeal the verdicts in the two cases brought by E. Jean Carroll. It could be years, I hope not, but it could be years before we have any final resolution. So I'm looking primarily, Anna, to see the reasoning in the judge's decision today. What conclusions did he draw from the evidence? How does he articulate that in his order? Because, of course, as the finder of fact in this case, it's his findings and his order that are going to be scrutinized on appeal.
And so, Chuck, real quick, we heard from Trump on the stand during this trial. We heard from his two sons, Don Jr. and Eric Trump. And I know intent is a piece of this, right, when it comes to the penalty here. So do you think that their testimony helped them potentially or hurt them more?
Yeah, again, it'll turn on a great question on whether or not the judge found them credible. Intent actually was not a requisite factor. It was not an element of the biggest core piece of this case, the one in which the judge has already found that Mr. Trump committed fraud. But Andrew is right. There were 6 other causes of action. Those do require intent. And it will be the judge and the judge alone here who determines whether or not Mr. Trump and his sons and all the other witnesses, for that matter, whether or not they were credible.
And so, Andrew, we were talking about, the unusual case of, using what you guys would call the corporate death sentence, right? But how unusual is this case in general?
It's fairly unusual for the size and as Charles said, the idea of barring somebody. You have seen from time to time the Attorney General's office in New York seek to bar someone for a shorter period of time. Indeed, they're seeking to bar both of the sons for 5 years. I can't say that's typical, but there is a really good argument that they put forward as to why Donald Trump Sr. Should be treated differently. Remember that there has been a finding of civil fraud with respect to the Trump, what's the right word, educational institution, if you want to even call it that it wasn't real. You have a criminal conviction of the Trump organization for tax fraud just last year. That's a criminal case beyond a reasonable doubt. You have this case where the judge has already found fraud. So if you're looking for a pattern of recidivism, and then you can throw in the defamation and the sexual assaults with respect to E. Jean Carroll at the federal level. So you have a whole history of this person.
And all of those things are to be considered?
That's all information that the judge can consider in deciding should this person be allowed to do business in New York, and because what the judge has to do is consider what is the right step to protect New Yorkers. That is what the Attorney General is tasked with doing. And I suspect that you will find some amount of time that Donald Trump is barred with an appeal. And certainly he has a right to appeal. So, he should be able to do that. Anybody should be able to do that. But there are mechanisms both at the federal level for E. Jean Carroll and at the state level to assure that there's money in the kitty, that the court has that money so that if the judgment's affirmed on appeal, there's money to make the state or E. Jean Carroll whole. So this isn't something that while the appeal happens, he gets to dissipate his assets. There's a way to make sure that the money is there now and doesn't go away.
The totality of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I do want to play a quick clip from Trump's attorney, Alina Habba, who was just asked about the anticipation of this verdict, and here's her response.
If I could file the appeal now, I would. There's no surprises coming here. It's much of the same that we've seen in New York, and I'll be loud and booming right after we get the decision. I mean, I don't have high hopes.
Charleston doesn't have high hopes. She's saying no surprises. What do you think?
There are no surprises. We know what's coming, and at this point, they're reading from a script, particularly when it comes to him and these judgments. These are things that they know are not going to go their way. It's just a question of how bad is bad in terms of what Judge Engelgard is going to decide. So this is not a surprise to anyone, including her, and she's basically at this point got a template for the appeal and just got to plug in the numbers. I mean, whatever arguments that she's going to make, they're really going to be, well, is it appropriate to bar us for whatever period that you've barred us if he goes that route? And we're going to argue about the amount of money that is being levied on us regardless of what it is, because our argument has been from the gate, we paid the banks back. So this is not a surprise to her or anyone else. And at this point, like I said, they're just reading from a script.
Andrew Weissman, Charles Coleman, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you all. And of course, please stay close, because up next, prison service.
We're back with some breaking news. Russian opposition leader and longtime Putin critic Alexei Navalny has died in prison, according to Russian prison officials and as reported by Russian state media. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has the latest.
Alexei Navalny was the most powerful opposition figure in all of Russia. He was a fearless opponent of Vladimir Putin. He was an anti-corruption campaigner. He'd been arrested many times. And now he is dead, according to prison officials in Russia. Alexei Navalny was just moved in December after disappearing for a few weeks, moved to a penal colony in Siberia, a frozen gulag 2,000 miles away from Moscow. And according to the prison officials, he took a walk this morning, immediately began to feel unwell, lost consciousness, that he was given medical attention, but that the staff at the prison were unable to revive him, and confirmed his death, and that news of his death was relayed to Vladimir Putin. Already we're hearing a lot of skepticism about this official account of events. Here in Ukraine, the President Zelensky said that it was Putin who's responsible for his death, that Putin had Navalny killed one way or another in order to hold on to power.
As Russia's leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny piled pressure on the Kremlin and put a target on his back. Born in 1976 in what was then the Soviet Union, Navalny trained as a lawyer and rose to prominence as a political blogger. In 2011, he started the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which exposed the extravagant wealth of Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin.
The biggest thing that Putin is afraid of is public discontent in Russia, and that is why it's so afraid of opposition leaders.
Navalny's and Putin's stars were intertwined. As Putin tightened his grip on power, Navalny became a leading figure at anti-government protests. "We will force them to live by the law because we hold the power here," he shouted. He was arrested countless times and turned attacks to his advantage. In 2017, after announcing his intentions to run for president, Navalny was attacked with green dye twice. "Maybe the Kremlin thinks that I will not record videos with a green face," he said, "but now even more people will watch." In 2019, as Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation gained support nationally, police raided their offices and arrested several activists, including, of course, Navalny. But in 2020, his life was threatened like never before. On a plane traveling from Siberia to Moscow, Navalny became deathly ill. He fell into a coma and was put on a ventilator. While recovering in a German hospital, investigators revealed he had been poisoned with Novichok, a Soviet-era neurotoxin. Navalny blamed Putin for the attack, a claim the Kremlin denies. Miraculously, Navalny recovered and participated in the investigation into his own poisoning, documenting the whole thing on social media. Despite the threats against his life, in January 2021, Navalny and his wife Yulia voluntarily returned to Moscow, where he was immediately arrested, ostensibly for violating the terms of a 2014 embezzlement case. Once in jail, he was tried and sentenced to more than 9 years in a maximum security prison. Navalny said the charges were politically motivated. But even behind bars, he found ways to make his voice heard, using social media to protest the Ukraine war and needle those in power. His legacy is one of defiance, a constant thorn in the side of the Kremlin.
Navalny's aides and members of his inner circle have not confirmed his death, but they say, if true, it is not a matter of Alexei Navalny dying, but of Alexei Navalny having been killed by Vladimir Putin.
Richard Engel, thank you very much. This morning, Vice President Harris is with world leaders in Munich for the annual security conference, giving this reaction to Navalny's death at the top of a major speech on foreign policy.
My prayers are with his family, including his wife, Yulia, who is with us today. And if confirmed, this would be a further sign of Putin's brutality. Whatever story they tell, let us be clear, Russia is responsible.
Joining us now from Munich is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, Navalny's wife, Yulia, spoke just after Vice President Kamala Harris there in Munich. What did she have to say?
Well, it was, a shock to the entire conference here at this summit in Munich. She had been here. She had, in fact, had dinner with friends, including Mike McFaul, our friend and contributor, of course, the former ambassador to Moscow last night. Did not know that anything was wrong, other than that he's been treated horribly in this gulag where he was sent in December about 1,000 miles, as Richard, or 2,000 miles rather, from Moscow, from where he had been before. So at the top of her remarks when she came out, she was speaking in Russian. This is the translation, that she thought long and hard about speaking. She wanted to just go to her children and be with her family, who are not here, of course. Her daughter has been studying in the United States. But she thought about what Alexei would do, and so she came out onto the stage right after Vice President Harris, an unannounced speaker, and she said that if true, they're hearing this from the Russian news services. She said they always lie, but if it's true, I want for Putin and all his friends, the government, to know they will pay a price for what they have done to our country, with our family and with my husband. That day, I say, will come very soon. I want to call on the world to unite and defeat this evil. It was very dramatic, and then she walked off the stage. What I've just learned now from our producer with Secretary Blinken, who is now about 20 minutes from here on the outskirts of Munich, and he's going to be doing a briefing. But backstage, he apparently in a private room met with Yulia Navalnaya, which is her name, Navalny's wife, and apparently imagine the condolences. He has been a hero to the world. I've met with several former German officials here who were very close to her and to, of course, Alexei Navalny. He was someone who was the hope of the opposition to Vladimir Putin. And Vice President Harris's speech was devoted to a strong defense of America in the world. She talked about the isolationism of recent developments in the U.S., obviously Donald Trump, and she was blistering about Vladimir Putin. And, of course, defense of Ukraine, which is on everyone's mind. I have to say, I've been traveling here with the Senate, bipartisan Senate delegation, and the congressional delegation. There are 45 members, both houses, very, very upset about the failure to approve money for Ukraine, which Europe has approved.
Andrew, I'm so glad that you mentioned that he was being held in a gulag in Siberia. I mean, it's as if, Stalin's torture chambers are still alive and well in Russia. And I'm just wondering, have you heard any reaction from, world leaders or people there that are in Munich to the death of someone who stood up against authoritarianism and, in many ways, totalitarianism, and paid with his life?
Well, he went back twice to Russia, knowing that it was a virtual death sentence. And the reaction here is horror. It's not unexpected. He had been ill and had been treated so badly, but he went for a walk. He just went for a walk and then got ill, and he was not ill yesterday. He did a video within 24 hours. So this was sudden, and the suspicion is that this was another assassination by the Russian intelligence, assassins. Of course, in Germany, there is a leading Russian assassin, an FSB member, who is in jail, and he is being held out by Putin as the only trade for, Evan Gershkovich. That is the demand that Putin repeated in that ridiculous non-interview that he did with Tucker Carlson just this week, that is what they want. And the Germans have not been willing to give him up. I talked to a top official today, a U.S. official. They are obviously in talks with Germany and with others around the world as to how to get Evan Gershkovich out. He's now been there almost a year, and the fear is whatever happens to people in Russian prisons, it could be a death sentence.
And
Jose,
we know,
Anna?
Andrea, thank you for that reporting. We know that in times past, President Biden has said there would be devastating consequences if Navalny died in prison. So we obviously have a developing story here. We'll continue.
Sau đó mình sẽ vào để công bóc trượt. Mình sẽ một phần mát tặng một vòng tròn ma thuật. Ở đây cho mình 6 mác đơn.